Hello, hello. All right. We're here for the second lecture on Jeffersonian America. So this is lecture 11.2. This time we're going to cover the last few key points, which are Thomas Jefferson and basically Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase. So with that, let's start off with and get into Jefferson himself, right? Thomas Jefferson is one of those amazing figures that's kind of like a jack of all trades. He could do and really did almost anything. He was a prolific writer, governor, he is a vice president, inventor, philosopher, scientist, architect. He's the one that drew up Monticello. He was a lawyer, ambassador to France, musician. For a little while, he was the only virtuoso violinist in America when he was younger, before he broke his hand. And he was a farmer and America's first vineyard operator. So, he's all over the place. This is a guy that was like Franklin. There really was no downtime with him. He was always doing something. Kind of give you a little background, kind of like we did with Washington, alongside of, all of his accomplishments here, things that he would do. He was, like Washington, he was very tall. He was over 6 feet. He was about 200 pounds. He was a very striking figure at the time. Very tall, very slender. And he had bright red hair. He is one of the few founders that he did keep his hair, and he kept it long, and he always kept it pulled back. Instead of wearing a wig, you saw his hair. With Jefferson, this is a guy, I think I told you guys in a lecture before, this is a guy that always lived beyond his means. Always. And he expected to live a very certain way. He would go in huge debt by the time of his death, and nobody ever really called him on it because he was Jefferson. He would have books and wine and anything and everything he'd want from Europe sent over to him in crates all the time, and people would just send it to him. He owed millions at his death. To kind of give you an idea of kind of the extravagance of his life, while he was president, even when he was president, he would always bring people over for dinners, and there'd be at least 8 courses every time. With this, they'd have their wine, the talk times, and it would all be a huge, huge affair. To kind of give you an idea, in his 2 terms as president, he ordered at least $16,500 worth of wine that he served at the White House. Today's, that's around $350,000. Another one, in 1804, he had a $3,000 champagne bill. And, his life was an extravagant one. Another one, kind of give you guys an idea of just food. For his 2 terms in office, he averaged right about $1,000 a day in eating. So for food at the White House, or food Monticello, when he was doing it when he had his 2 terms as president, and he was entertaining people, or not even entertaining people, when he was just he and the family and whatever. On an average day, he averaged about $11,000 a day eating. I'm sorry, $1,000 a day. Please remember that, $1,000 a day. That's a hell of a lot of money now. Just in context, I mean, he lived an extravagant life, but he was a very different kind of guy. This was a academic in office, all right? This was a man that had, where ideas and ideologies were more important to him in many ways than reality. So, this is an individual that really promoted what we talked about last time, that cultural nationalism, which is of huge importance. He's the one that believed that the backbone of America was the farmer, that the farmer and that way of life is what could make America great. It's what could make each individual a master of their own domain, the king of their own castle, so to speak. And this was his push for America, that everybody was educated, people were educated, people participated in a democratic government, and that the American economy was based on this agricultural economy. He was also a big promoter of political freedom. We talked about that with the Whiskey Rebellion, how he resigned after that. He was always a big proponent that people had the right to protest, participate in government. He was also a big promoter of religious freedom. He never recognized any religion. And he never gave any talks or speeches for a Catholic church, a Protestant church, or any kind of affiliation or religion. He believed that was the government intruding upon religious bounds. So he pushed for this idea of religious freedom, political freedom. The center of American culture should be the farmer. He also pushed for this idea of equality. This was a huge thing for him, this idea that all men were created equal. Also, like I mentioned, public education. You could not have people participating in a democracy. You cannot have a democracy thrive if you had an uneducated populace. So he really pushed the idea of public education and how Americans needed to be educated. Also, this idea of intellectual freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, that people should be able to say, think, and write, and not worry about being penalized for that. And with all of these ideas, it's crazy to us that someone can feel so strongly and fight their entire life for all these things. But at the same time, only see this for one small group of people. He did see slavery as an evil. He tried to abolish it numerous times and always got shot down with this. But personally, he never saw whites and blacks as equals. And he never saw women as being equal to men. So his push, this idea of political freedom, religious freedom, intellectual freedom, physical freedom, this idea of equality only pertained to white men, right? And for him, this was a big thing, that because nobody had ever seen it before, they had never had it before in Europe, always that aristocratic and royal blood had everything and everybody else had nothing. So to him, the idea of equality and freedom was for all white men. So with this Jeffersonian idealism that we still promote to this day, the idea of all men being created equal, everybody needs to have a public education, everybody should have religious freedom. We, you know, a lot of these ideas in the American sense come to us from him through other people, but come to us from him. But for him, it was just for white dudes. Also, another very important thing to remember with Jefferson, democracy, as it's not it's not what you believed. It's not like political beliefs, like I believe in conservatism or I believe in liberalism. I believe. People are always telling you what they believe in politics. For Jefferson, democracy was more social habits. A lot of the older founders were like this. The whole idea of it was not voting on belief, not voting on, you know, how you were raised and what you believe in, as much as it was to participate and vote based on knowledge. The social habits of democracy to him were you were to study the newspapers, study the politicians, study the people in office, study. Politics was something that didn't happen every few years. It was something that happened daily. So with democracy, for democracy to work in Jefferson's eyes, Americans had to be obsessed with politics and had to keep up with it constantly. You had to know what everybody was doing at all times in Congress, in the executive, in the judicial. You wanted to know what people were doing. And by knowing how things were going, you were educated in knowing how democracy was functioning, whether you liked it or not, and if you thought you should put somebody else in office or not. You were, in Jefferson's mind, not truly a student of democracy if you were not actively studying the politicians. So we've got Jeffersonian idealism, all the things he fought for, what he thought everybody needed. As Jefferson came into office, he promised three things. He said that he was going to have a simplistic American government. He would have a strong American economy, and he would end the rule of the elite. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on for the rest of his presidency. Did Jefferson live up to his campaign promises? So let's talk about the presidency. And with the presidency, the big thing to remember is he really does help establish and kind of lay out the reality of American government in the 1800s. All right, the big thing to kind of look at, if you want to start getting into and understanding American politics, in the 1800s, for that almost 100-year stretch, you'll see this idea of America being a republic plays a large role. And Jefferson would be the one that would really push this. All right. Jefferson was against large government. He pushed for small government on the national level, and that the states would have more power and more control. All right. During his reign as president for 2 terms, he played a very informal role for the most part, and Congress ruled. For most of the founders, and all the way up to Andrew Jackson, most American presidential most American presidents and most American political figures believed that Congress was the main hub of American government. Because Congress was the one that made the laws. It was the one that had the most people. It was the one where America voted and put all these people in there to create the laws that they wanted. So Congress had more emphasis in Jeffersonian republicanism. The president, not as much importance. So we have the idea of small and limited government. Also, Jefferson wanted America to stay agriculturally based. He did not like this idea of moving into what would become industrialization and modernizing of the economy. He wanted America to stay agricultural. He wanted the family farms. He wanted just to stay what America started off as. He believed that simplistic life would keep America focused and going down the right path. Also, he does come through and become very successful in his terms as shrinking the government. Jefferson drastically downsizes government during this time. A lot of positions would just go unfilled. He believed that we didn't need them. Also, he would get rid of certain departments. Also, during this time, he would pay off. He and his Congress that he worked with would pay off a third of the American debt, which was a huge step forward. This was a big thing for Jefferson. One of his famous quotes is, "The earth belongs to the current generation." He was a really big proponent of this. He thought that the past held people in chains. He did not want America's past to impede what America's future children could do. In other words, he didn't want us tied down by debt. He didn't want us tied down by old ways. He thought that every generation should see the world in a new way. Every generation is better educated than the last, and every generation should be allowed to create their own world. And with a debt, with patriotism, with a lot of things, these things hold people back. They hold people back and hold them into old paradigms, old ways of thought, and stifles growth, stifles, progress in a lot of ways. So Jefferson was always pushing this idea that the world always belongs to the current generation, that debt is something that needs to be gotten rid of, old ways of thought are something that not need to be gotten rid of, that each generation should be allowed its turn on this planet to create their own world. Also, Jefferson was like I told you, was a really big pusher of participatory politics. He pushed this idea that the only way for democracy to work is if everybody participated. For him, of course, that meant all landed white guys had to be involved. They all had to study politics. They all had to know what was going on so they could vote knowingly. And they had to vote in every election, not just the presidential election, but local, state, in every aspect. They had to participate in politics. Also, one of the big things that happens with him shrinking the government, with the way he runs things, those first eight years of the 1800s, the American people like it. It's a very hands-off, very limited government. And one of the things he promised was to end elitism, this idea of the elite. And for Jefferson, the elite were the Federalists, people like John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, all of these guys that had old ways of thinking. As Jefferson put it, continental ways of thinking. They were too European, too held back by old paradigms of thought. So with his popularity, with everything that was going on during the early 1800s, during the aughts, you'll see that the Federalists, by the end of the teens, become obsolete. And to him, this was him ending the elite. Also, Jefferson was a really big purveyor and pusher of cultural nationalism, which we talked about last time. This idea that the American is the self-made man. He pulls himself up by the bootstraps. He creates his own world. And the harder he works, the better this world becomes. Also, that all Americans needed to be educated. You needed a good education to participate in democracy. You needed a good education to be a part of the modern world. And with this, you'll see this idea of nationalism, this idea of being an American, was not really based on your government. Not like it was with England and Spain, where it was like, well, look, I come from the most powerful country. My country's richer than your country, so we're number one. This is cultural nationalism, what became a core of what it means to be an American. It has nothing to do with the government, but everything to do with opportunity. The idea that the average person is king of their own castle, right? They can do and become anything. So this idea of cultural nationalism is from the ground roots, from the grassroots up. This idea that, the average American farmer, through hard work, through education, can become the backbone of a nation. Not the rich, powerful elites, but the average working guy. So you get this part of the Jeffersonian idealism that really keeps going throughout the 1800s. So today's a pretty easy one. We're not going too long. It's only going to be about 30 minutes long, maybe not that long. We're going to wrap up with the Louisiana Purchase. This is one of the monumental events in American history, and it does happen to fall in Jefferson's terms as president. This was technically an unconstitutional, illegal act that Jefferson would do. But nobody really made a big deal out of it. You had a few politicians that went after him. But for the most part, everybody was excited to get all this land. The Louisiana Purchase basically doubled the size of the U.S. It all started with Jefferson wanting to buy New Orleans. All right, he wanted to buy New Orleans from the French. By controlling the mouth of the Mississippi River, he believed he would gain access to and control of the Mississippi River for the Americans, and also take the French out of the equation. He wanted to get buy as much French land, and get the French out of North American politics. At this point, you have the Napoleonic Wars going on. Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, and the wars were raging in Europe between Napoleon and the rest of Europe. And Jefferson was afraid that we'd get dragged into it. So he was trying to stabilize control of the important waterways and important land to make sure that the French and British wouldn't start fighting here. And he was also trying to take advantage of the French because they needed money because of the wars. So he sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France to purchase New Orleans. They were ignored for a very long time, but finally people started seeing them, and they were asked if they'd be willing to purchase all of that territory. Like I said, the Louisiana Purchase territory doubles the size of the U.S. And it they'd be willing to purchase all of this territory, not just New Orleans. Jefferson had already given them the okay to go upwards of $9 million to purchase New Orleans. And when it came back, when the opportunity arose to do this Louisiana Purchase territory, the French wanted $15 million. So that's basically a penny an acre for this Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson jumped on it, told them that he would take it, basically wrote the check and okayed the deal, and never even had congressional approval. Like I said, it was illegal. This was something that shouldn't have happened, but did. With this purchase, this is of huge significance. This is the frontier. This is the first major step that we have going west. This is the beginning of expansion and what most people would think of as manifest destiny, right? With the Louisiana Purchase, you have all kinds of explorers, both working for Jefferson and just explorers in general, head west. The most famous, of course, are Lewis and Clark with the Corps of Discovery, and another very famous one is Montgomery Zebulon Pike. Those two groups of explorers would explore most of the Louisiana Purchase territory and send back information to Jefferson and samples of everything, so Jefferson knew what he had purchased. He was obsessed with this territory for most of his remaining part of his presidency. And if you go to Monticello to this day, you can still see a lot of the fossils, artifacts, and everything else that would be sent to him from this Corps of Discovery, especially with Lewis and Clark. So, we have Jefferson, we have the Louisiana Purchase territory, we have a really solidification of what American government would look like under his reign and how it would tend to function for most of the 1800s.